The voice of time awakens. Beneath the cold embers of a vanished empire, there lies a story written not in ink, but in blood and silence. The story of a man born to rule the world's largest kingdom, yet powerless to rule his own fate. In the twilight halls of power, he was called Tsar. In the dim hours of exile, he was called prisoner. And in the final breath of night, he became a whisper history could never forget. This is the tragic life of Tsar Nicholas II. Chapter 1, The Last Son of Empire. He entered the world beneath the weight of a crown he did not yet know, in the gleam of palaces gilded by centuries of power. Born in 1868, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was not meant to be extraordinary, only dutiful, kind, and quiet, a child of privilege in a realm of frozen winters and endless prayers. His father, Alexander III, was the image of strength, broad, commanding, a man whose voice alone could silence a room. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, was grace incarnate, a Danish princess who filled the marble corridors of the Winter Palace with warmth. Nicholas grew beneath their gaze like a candle shielded from the wind, gentle, but fragile. He preferred books to banquets, the soft rustle of birch leaves to the echo of commands. The court saw him as mild, almost shy, unfit, perhaps, for the storm that would one day come. But destiny has little patience for the quiet-hearted. When his grandfather, Alexander II, the liberator Tsar, was torn apart by an assassin's bomb, the air of St. Petersburg thickened with fear. Nicholas was 13. He watched as morning swept through the empire like black snow. His father, hardened by loss, vowed to rule with iron. And Nicholas learned that mercy was a weakness the throne could not afford. Yet within him, the seed of gentleness endured. As he grew, so too did the empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, across forests, deserts, and dreams. But beneath the surface, discontent smoldered, the murmurs of peasants, the cries of workers, the hunger of millions bound by poverty and faith. Nicholas saw little of it. His world was one of candlelight, tutors, and gardens. He kept a diary, pages filled not with decrees or thoughts of destiny, but with simple notes of weather, family dinners, and long walks. Had tea with Mama, he once wrote. Went skating. The sky was clear. In those quiet lines lay the soul of a man who sought peace in a world that demanded thunder. Then, in 1894, the storm broke. His father, the great pillar of the empire, fell ill. The giant who had once seemed carved from granite weakened before Nicholas's eyes. And when Alexander III died that November, the empire trembled. Nicholas was 26. The crown, heavy, ancient, merciless, descended upon him. He wept when told he would be Tsar. "I am not ready," he whispered. "I never wanted to be." But history does not ask who is ready. It only asks who remains. And so, in a cathedral blazing with gold and incense, amid the prayers of thousands, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was anointed Tsar of all the Russias. The empire bowed. Bells rang. Cannons roared. Yet beneath the crown, a single thought lingered, fragile and unspoken. Can a gentle heart survive a ruthless world? Chapter 2, A Marriage of Faith and Shadows. Love, when it comes to kings, is rarely kind. It is a chain of duty, not a dance of hearts. But in the gentle stillness of the Russian twilight, Nicholas found something different, something almost human. Her name was Alix of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a shy and radiant woman whose heart was made of devotion and doubt. They met not in ceremony, but in quiet hours, letters, glances, moments stolen between dynasties. To him, she was a refuge. To her, he was faith made flesh. Yet even love, in the house of Romanov, carried the scent of incense and foreboding. When the empire learned of their affection, whispers rippled through the gilded corridors. A foreigner, some hissed. A German princess, others murmured, as though her blood alone could curse a throne. But Nicholas, for once, defied the weight of crowns. On the eve of his father's death, he wrote to Alix. "My soul is yours. My love for you and Russia shall be one." And so, within weeks of his coronation, amid black mourning veils and golden icons, they were wed. A wedding of tears and splendor, the Tsar in mourning black, the Tsarina in white silk, beneath the echoing bells of St. Petersburg. The empire watched. Some with hope. Many with doubt. Alix, now Alexandra Fyodorovna, entered the Russian court as an outsider cloaked in destiny. She carried with her a fervent faith, one that saw God not in power, but in suffering. To her, Nicholas was not just her husband, he was her holy calling. And in that devotion, shadows began to bloom. The court, once a place of laughter and intrigue, grew still under her presence. She shunned gossip, avoided the grand balls, preferred prayer to politics. Ministers found her cold, nobles found her strange. But Nicholas adored her all the more, for in her silence, he found peace from the roaring world outside. Together, they retreated often to Tsarskoye Selo, a palace of gardens and golden halls where time seemed to pause. There they walked among birch trees, played with their children, and wrote letters to one another even when they were only rooms apart. It was love, pure, unwavering, and tragically blind. For as the world turned, the empire began to crack. Beyond the palace gates, famine gnawed at the countryside. Factories in Moscow and St. Petersburg thundered with unrest. New words, dangerous words, whispered in taverns and schools. Equality. Revolution. Freedom. Nicholas heard them faintly, like the echo of a distant storm. But he could not bear to believe that the world could ever turn against the hand of God's anointed. Instead, he clung to the one thing he could control, his family. When his first child, Olga, was born in 1895, the empire rejoiced. But the joy quickly dimmed when no son followed. Another daughter came, Tatiana. Then Maria. Then Anastasia. Each one loved beyond measure, each one a light in Nicholas's heart. But the empire's patience wore thin. For daughters, they whispered. And still no heir. The ancient laws demanded a son, the thread by which the crown itself was tied to God. Without one, the Romanov line trembled. And so, when Alexandra bore her fifth child, Nicholas prayed not as a Tsar, but as a father. In the summer of 1904, his prayers were answered. A son was born, Alexei Nikolaevich, Tsarevich of Russia. Bells rang from St. Isaac's to Vladivostok. Cannons thundered. The people rejoiced. But in the joy of that moment, no one yet saw the shadow that came with him. For Alexei carried within him a secret, a curse of the blood. The doctors whispered the word in silence, hemophilia. A wound that would not heal. A body that could not bleed without danger. And with that, love itself, once Nicholas's refuge, became his greatest vulnerability. For every cry of pain from his son would soon summon a name that history would never forget. Rasputin. Chapter 3, The Holy Man and the Hemophiliac Prince. In every age, there walks a man the world cannot quite explain, part saint, part shadow. To some, a messenger of God. To others, a serpent in a robe. For the Romanovs, that man was Grigory Rasputin. He came from the frozen soil of Siberia, a wanderer, a mystic, a man who claimed to speak with heaven and tremble with its power. His eyes, they said, could burn through lies. His hands could heal the dying. And in a world where hope had grown thin, such a man was both miracle and menace. He arrived in St. Petersburg as whispers precede a storm. The city was alive with vice and curiosity, and Rasputin, tall, unwashed, wrapped in coarse robes, moved through it like a specter. In the salons of nobles and the drawing rooms of duchesses, tales of his power grew with each retelling. A man of God, they said. A mad monk, others spat. But none of them mattered. For one night, in the quiet desperation of the royal palace, Rasputin met the one family that would change his destiny, and he theirs. The young Tsarevich Alexei had fallen again. His blood, thin and treacherous, had filled his joints with agony. The doctors could do nothing. Alexandra wept by his bedside, hands clasped, faith breaking. And then Rasputin entered. No crown, no title, no fear. He knelt beside the dying boy, murmured a prayer, and told the empress to stop the doctor's treatments. They obeyed, out of exhaustion, out of faith, or both. The next morning, Alexei's bleeding stopped. And in that moment, the empress believed. To her, he was the answer to every whispered prayer. To Nicholas, the man who could calm his wife's trembling heart. But to the empire, he was something else entirely. Rasputin's presence in the palace became an open wound. His rough manners, his piercing stare, his unguarded tongue, all clashed with the perfumed order of the court. Ministers whispered of his influence. Bishops denounced him. Newspapers called him a devil cloaked in holiness. Yet Alexandra, bound by faith and fear, clung to him. He alone understands, she wrote in her letters. When he prays, our son is saved. Nicholas, torn between love and duty, turned a blind eye. The Tsar, the autocrat of all the Russias, had begun to yield his palace to superstition, one quiet prayer at a time. And so, as Rasputin's shadow lengthened, so too did the empire's unrest. The peasants starved. The factories burned with strikes. The soldiers grumbled. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, and the word Tsar began to lose its sanctity. Yet within the walls of Tsarskoye Selo, Nicholas and Alexandra lived in another world, a cocoon of faith, family, and denial. They watched their children grow, walked their gardens, and believed that prayers alone could hold back the tide. But history, like the sea, does not listen to prayer. It listens to hunger. It listens to rage. And soon, a war would come, not of faith, but of fire. A war that would sweep away empires, kings, and crowns alike. The Great War. The beginning of the end. Chapter 4, The Empire at War. The year was 1914. Europe, proud and glittering, stood upon the edge of ruin, though none yet saw the abyss. Alliances bound in ink and arrogance would soon be written again in blood. And in the gilded chambers of St. Petersburg, the echoes of war arrived like distant thunder. For Russia, the call to arms was not just politics, it was prophecy. The Tsar, God's chosen ruler, would defend the Slavs of Serbia. The empire would march in righteousness, and the world would tremble before its faith. Nicholas stood upon the balcony of the Winter Palace as crowds below chanted his name. For the Tsar. For Holy Russia. And for a moment, he believed again. He believed in the myth of unity, in the dream that still tied him to his ancestors. That a crown could command loyalty, that love of God could silence hunger. The soldiers marched with icons and hymns. Priests blessed their rifles. Mothers sent their sons to die with trembling pride. But the empire was not the fortress it once had been. Its army was vast, yet ill-fed, ill-armed, ill-led. Its factories starved of coal and steel. Its generals, relics of another age, sent men into modern slaughter with 19th-century pride. And soon, the blood of Russia began to fill the frozen soil of Poland and Galicia. Reports of loss came daily, 1,000 dead, then 10,000, then cities swallowed whole. At first, Nicholas read them with calm faith. God will not abandon us, he said. But by the second year, the calm had turned to desperation. The ministers argued. The Duma cursed. And in the streets, bread vanished. Alexandra, now more alone than ever, wrote to her husband with trembling devotion. All is confusion here, but I know God will show you the way. Trust only Him, and our friend. Our friend. Rasputin's name had become her prayer and her shield. While Nicholas was at the front, Rasputin's whispers filled the palace halls. He advised the empress on ministers, on generals, on the fate of the empire itself. To the court, it was madness. To Alexandra, it was divine will. And as Nicholas left Petrograd to lead his armies personally, the empire's fate slipped from his hands entirely. He went to war not as a strategist, but as a believer. In the mud and cold of the Eastern Front, he walked among soldiers, silent and sorrowful, blessing the wounded, listening to their grief. They loved him, for his gentleness, his humanity. But love does not win wars. Behind him, the capital rotted. Ministers betrayed each other for favor. Nobles plotted in candlelit salons. Rasputin, drunk with confidence and adoration, grew careless, flaunting his influence, mocking his enemies. In taverns and newspapers, the people spat his name with hatred. The monk rules Russia, they said. The Tsar is his puppet. The sacred bond between Nicholas and his people, that ancient thread, began to fray beyond repair. And then, the unthinkable. In December of 1916, a conspiracy was born beneath the chandeliers of a palace. Princes and politicians, once loyal to the throne, decided that for Russia to live, Rasputin must die. On a winter's night, they invited him to a noble's cellar with promises of wine and laughter. He drank, he laughed, he prayed. And then, he was poisoned. Shot. Beaten. Cast into the frozen Neva River. They said he would not die. But he did. And with him, the last illusion of divine protection died too. When Alexandra received the news, she locked herself in prayer for days. Nicholas, at the front, wrote only one line in his diary. "A great sin has been committed." But by then, sins no longer mattered. The empire was collapsing. The war was lost. The people had turned. And far away, in the frozen streets of Petrograd, a new sound was rising. Not the chant of soldiers. Not the hymn of priests. But the roar of revolution. Chapter 5, The Fall of the Romanovs. The winter of 1917 arrived not with snow, but with hunger. In the streets of Petrograd, bread vanished, coal disappeared, and faith, once the empire's heartbeat, turned to frost. The people who had once knelt for blessings now raised their fists. Factories stood silent, their chimneys black and still. Soldiers, ragged and starving, deserted their posts and joined the crowds. And from every window, the same cry echoed through the frozen air. Down with the Tsar. Nicholas, still at the front, refused to believe it. His diaries in those final weeks were calm, almost serene. "Had tea with the officers," he wrote. "Weather clear. But history does not wait for tea." In Petrograd, the Duma defied his orders. Generals hesitated to act. Even the Imperial Guard, once the pride of the crown, began to waver. And then, in March 1917, the inevitable happened. On a train bound for home, Nicholas II, Emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, signed his abdication. No ceremony. No final speech. Just ink, silence, and the end of a 1,000-year throne. His words were few. "For the good of Russia, I abdicate in favor of my brother, Mikhail." But his brother refused. And so, for the first time since the age of Ivan the Terrible, Russia had no Tsar. When the news reached the capital, there were no tears. The people poured into the streets, waving red flags where once had flown the imperial eagle. The monarchy had fallen, not by foreign swords, but by its own weary heart. Nicholas returned not to a throne, but to captivity. The family was placed under house arrest, first at Tsarskoye Selo, surrounded by the same gardens where they had once laughed. Guards now patrolled the marble halls. Windows were shuttered. Telephones removed. Yet inside, life tried to continue. The children studied, prayed, played piano. Alexandra wrote letters to her husband, sealed with trembling devotion. Nicholas chopped wood in the garden, his once royal hands blistered and bare. He never complained. In his diary he wrote, "It is quiet. We are together. That is enough." But the storm outside grew darker still. In Petrograd, the provisional government fought to hold the fragments of power. Meanwhile, in smoky halls and underground meetings, another force was gathering. The Bolsheviks. Men who spoke of equality, bread, and vengeance. And at their head, Vladimir Lenin, returned from exile like a shadow long suppressed. His words burned through the cold air. Peace, land, and bread. The people listened. And the world that Nicholas had known, the world of crowns, icons, and divine order, began to dissolve forever. In the summer of 1917, the family was moved again, farther east, deeper into the heart of Russia. The journey was quiet. The train moved through endless birch forests and fields of mist, away from the cities, away from memory. The empire was gone. Only the family remained. A Tsar without a throne. A queen without a court. And children who no longer believed in tomorrow. Beyond the glass of their carriage, Russia drifted by, vast, beautiful, indifferent. And somewhere in that silence, the ghost of history sighed. It is almost over. Chapter 6, Exile and Echoes. The train carried them eastward, not toward freedom, but toward forgetting. For days, it wound through forests and plains, its whistle echoing across the white emptiness. Inside the carriages, the royal family sat quietly, the Tsar reading scripture, Alexandra holding a cross, the children watching the world blur past. No guard spoke. No one dared call them, Your Majesty. They were simply the Romanov family now, prisoners of the revolution, ghosts still breathing. Their destination was Tobolsk, a distant town on the frozen edge of Siberia, once a place of exiles and convicts, now home to an emperor without an empire. The house they were given was modest, white walls, barred windows, a wooden fence. A former governor's mansion, now their gilded cage. Yet even here, Nicholas sought peace. He chopped wood each morning, tended the stove, played games with his daughters. He called it, our quiet village life. The children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, tried to turn confinement into routine. They studied, sewed, and wrote in diaries of birds and prayers, never of fear. Anastasia made jokes to lift their spirits, Maria sang softly while mending her brother's clothes. They were a family still, stripped of power, but bound by love. Alexandra's health waned. Rasputin's death had shattered her faith, yet she still whispered his name in prayer. Her letters to Nicholas were filled with hope, hope that someday, mercy would find them. But mercy does not travel far in times of revolution. As months passed, the new Russia grew restless. The Bolsheviks seized Petrograd. The provisional government fell like autumn leaves. And far away, in the stillness of Tobolsk, the Romanovs felt the shift like a chill in the walls. Guards changed. Orders changed. They were told they would be moved again, for their safety. In April of 1918, under cover of night, they were taken from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg, a city of factories, iron, and fear. The journey was long and silent. Alexei, weak from illness, was carried on a stretcher through the snow. Their new home was called the Ipatov House. Locals whispered its other name. The House of Special Purpose. It was small, surrounded by high fences and guards with bayonets. Inside, the windows were painted over so no one could see in, or out. The family's days became shorter. No walks in the garden. No letters. No news. They prayed each evening together, their voices a faint echo in the wooden halls. In her diary, Olga wrote, "Father reads to us every night. We try to keep cheerful. Everything passes." But time was no longer passing, it was closing. The war outside still raged. Armies moved, empires fell, kings fled. And in the heart of Russia, the last Tsar and his family waited, not for freedom, but for the final page of their story. In the stillness of that house, the ghost of history whispered. Even love cannot survive forever, but its echo might. Chapter 7, The Final Night. July 16, 1918. The night was still, heavy with the silence that comes before an ending. Inside the Epilogue house, the Romanovs slept uneasily. Guards whispered outside, boots echoing against stone. In her diary, Tatiana had written only a few hours before. The weather is warm. We played cards. Everything is as usual. But nothing was usual anymore. Just past midnight, a messenger arrived, a man in uniform, his face unreadable. He knocked once on the door, entered, and spoke softly. You are to be moved for your safety. Please, dress quickly. Nicholas nodded without question. The family gathered their things, a pillow, a prayer book, a few small treasures. The daughters helped Alexei to his chair, his legs were weak, his body frail. They descended the narrow staircase to the basement, candles trembling in their hands. The room was small, its walls bare, a single light bulb swinging above. The Tsar stood beside his wife. Behind them, the children waited in silence. For a moment, there was peace, the kind that exists only seconds before the storm. Then, the door opened again. The guards entered, rifles in hand. Nicholas turned to them calmly. I see, he said quietly. You have come for us. The order was read, curt, bureaucratic, final. In light of the counter-revolutionary plots, the executive committee has decided to execute the former Tsar Nicholas Romanov. Alexandra crossed herself. The Tsar's last words were whispered to his children. Remember that we have done nothing wrong. A flash, a sound. And then, the roar of eternity. In less than a minute, the line of Romanovs, 3 centuries of power, faith, and blood, was gone. The soldiers left in silence, their boots red with dust and history. Outside, the city slept beneath a pale gray dawn. In the garden, the birches swayed gently, as though bowing to ghosts. The house stood quiet, a tomb disguised as a home. No one spoke of it openly. The new world had no room for saints or emperors. Yet the story refused to fade. Whispers traveled through Russia, of jewels sewn into corsets, of loyal servants burying bodies in secret, of prayers whispered in the dark. For years, their names were forbidden. Their faces erased from portraits, their titles stripped from memory. But memory is a stubborn thing. In the end, it is not crowns that endure, it is echoes. And somewhere, in that quiet room beneath the earth, the ghost of history still lingers, whispering to those who will listen. They were not saints. They were not tyrants. They were human, and they were doomed. And thus, the empire of the Tsars came to rest. Not with thunder, but with a whisper. Chapter 8, Epilogue, The Echo That Remained. The snow fell quietly over Ekaterinburg, soft as forgiveness. The house stood empty. The echoes of voices, laughter, prayer, footsteps, faded into the frost. For years, the world did not speak their names. A new flag flew over Russia, red and unyielding. Churches became warehouses. Palaces turned to ruins. The Tsar was gone, the empire dissolved. Yet something in the air still remembered. In hidden churches, old women lit candles for Nikolai and his children. In songs whispered by peasants, their names returned like embers in the wind. Decades passed. Empires fell again, and time, relentless as snow, buried their memory. Until history itself grew curious. In the late years of the century, their resting place was found. Deep in a forest, bones buried beneath the roots of birch and thyme. The world watched as Russia, trembling, looked back at its own reflection. The family was given what they had been denied. A burial, a prayer, a name. And so the last Tsar of Russia, the reluctant ruler, the gentle soul. The man who believed faith could still hold back the tide, was finally laid to rest beside his wife and children. Beneath the marble cross, their story was written not as triumph or failure, but as a question whispered across centuries. What becomes of power when love is its only defense? The ghost of history moves softly now, through ruined palaces and silent cathedrals. Past icons kissed by strangers who will never know their faces. It speaks still, not of crowns, but of humanity. Of fathers and daughters. Of faith and folly. Of endings that are never truly gone. For history does not die. It dreams. And in that dream, the Romanovs walk again. In candlelight, in snow. In the endless echo of a world that once believed it could last forever. This has been the story of Tsar Nicholas II. The last emperor of a dying world. And though his crown has turned to dust, his echo endures.